nutrition, they create two nuclei within their bodies, within their cells, and then the cells separate, and you have two nuclei that are identical to one another. Same exact DNA that's recombined in the same order, the same structure, and the two cells separate in half, and you have two identical cells. This is a process that's called mitosis, M-I-T-O-S-I-S. Mitosis is the reproduction of normal body cells. It's the simplest reproductive process in your body. And each of your body cells has what are called a diploid chromosomal structure. They have your full DNA sequence. And that's 46 chromosomes. Just to clarify, a chromosome is essentially your DNA that is packaged into a particular structure. It usually looks sort of like an X or a Y. But a chromosome is DNA. And it's if you've ever tried to unravel Christmas lights from last year, you know how tough it can be to try and unravel and make sense of a strand of lights. Well, your DNA, which is you've got 46 of them in each of your body cells. You've got strands of DNA, 46 strands of DNA packaged into chromosomes in each of your cells. 1 trillion cells, and if you were to unravel each of those chromosomes, it would be more than 6 feet tall, each and every single one of them. Huge amount of DNA. So it helps to have these packaged into neat little coils that are well organized. Unlike a prokaryote, which has got the DNA all over the place, our nuclei in our very well organized cells keep them packaged into chromosomes is what they're called. And we have the number 46. It's absolutely irrelevant. Having more or less, fewer or more chromosomes does not make you better or worse. Algae has like 146 chromosomes, or 148, I can't remember. I do have that. 148 has algae. Camels have 70. Potatoes have 48, 2 more chromosomes than we do. But a fly has 12 and a salamander has 24. It's irrelevant. Don't worry about the number, but other than the fact that our number, humans' number, is 46. That is our number. Every single cell in your body, save one kind, which I'll come to in a moment, has 46 chromosomes in it. Now, that's all great, right? So all of the functions in your body, your brain, your skin, your eyes, your heart, your liver, all of these things have body cells that are guided by the same 46 chromosomes that have the DNA, your full DNA sequence, and tell your body how to live. But when we go to reproduce, we're not single-celled organisms anymore. We can't just separate ourselves, and I can't just split myself in half and then I'm a clone of myself. I've got one of me over here and another of me over here. It doesn't work that way. Also, as we're going to see, and as we saw last chapter, natural selection is working on variety. And so if I just cloned myself, if I had all the same characteristics that I had before, then natural selection would not be working on variety, it would be working on sameness. That if I was well adapted for certain situations, that's great, but if those conditions changed, then both of my clones would be vulnerable and those would both be maladapted, and I'd go extinct. My line would go extinct. So what multicellular organisms tend to do, not always, there are some organisms that do it a little bit differently, and that's a little bit through attrition. So things like sponges and hydras, they just reproduce billions of clones of themselves and say, all right, you're on your own. Most of you are going to be food, but maybe some of you will be successful. But for organisms like ourselves, more complex organisms have special cells that are designed for reproduction, and these are called gametes. So somatic cells are your body cells, and your gametes are your sex cells. For in humans, sex cells in animals are the eggs, which are called ova in females, and the sperm for males. And if you were to have 46 chromosomes in your sperm and egg, when they combined, then you would have too many chromosomes in the offspring, right? You would have 94, or sorry, you would have too many chromosomes in the outcome, right? So you need to have 46, and you don't want 92. You want 46. So the outcome of this is a different process that takes place when gametes reproduce themselves. And we'll talk about that. They replicate through a process called meiosis. So mitosis is for somatic cells, and gametes, your sex cells, reproduce through meiosis, which is MEIOSIS. Meiosis is the special process by which this one kind of cell, which is specifically for reproduction, is produced. And this meiosis process produces, from one cell, produces 4 daughter cells, each of which has 23 chromosomes in them. Now those are useful because when you have sexual reproduction, the egg and the sperm come together, and you have the result, which is 23, and 23 reproduces into 46, which is a full human sequence of DNA, right? The full DNA code that you need for life. In fact, these companies, 23andMe gets its number from the sex cells, so 23 chromosomes, hence 23andMe. So what is DNA and what does it do? Well, DNA is, like I said, it's a string of chemicals. That's all it is. Don't think of, and it's sometimes hard for me, and I apologize in advance if I do this, it's sometimes hard for me to talk about DNA without anthropomorphizing it, without making it seem like it's intending to do something, but that's not the way it works. It's mechanistic and it's chemical, and that's all it is. It's made up of 3 basic parts, which are a phosphate and a sugar, which is the sort of ribbon that wraps around. It's the sort of, if you've got a ladder, it's the struts that hold the rungs together, right? And so the sugars and the phosphates are really just the rungs of this, or the struts of the ladder. They only hold it up. That's really all it is. But to go through the process, you've got to go on each of the steps of the ladder. That's the really important bit to DNA. So the phosphates and the sugar are inert. They're just a backbone to this. It's the nitrogen base pairs, the nucleotide base pairs, which are the kind of moving parts to this. The metaphor I used before were the magnets, right? And these are 4 types. That's called A, T, G, and C. And these stand for adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And A always goes with T, and T always goes with A. You will never get an A going with a G. You will never get adenine and guanine coming together. They repel one another. They will never connect, right? It's not possible. You don't get that. It's not a thing. So adenine goes with thymine, and guanine goes to cytosine. And these are the rungs. You've got on the ladder of DNA, which is twisted into a double helix. You've got an adenine, and you always know that the other side that pairs up with it is going to be a thymine. And if you have a thymine on this side, you know that the other side is going to be an adenine. Likewise, if you've got a guanine, you know that the other side is going to be a cytosine. So G is always with C, C is always with G, T is always with A is always with T. Always, 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 always. Now, that means that if you take this ladder apart and you split it in the middle, you pull it apart, you only have to have half of that ladder, and you know how to recombine it. Now, this is really important for reproduction because this is exactly the way cells reproduce, is they pull this ladder apart with each of the the halves of that ladder attached to them, and you've got, let's say, CAAT over here. That means that you know that the other side to come back together is going to be a GTTTA, right? So you always know. And this is precisely what your cells are doing all the time in creating your body and doing what you need to do. So that partly that's for replicating cells, that you pull it apart and then you take nutrition and component parts and you have one strand go off this way, one half of that ladder go in this direction, and then recombine with the CAAT that corresponds over here, and then this one would be the GATTTC on this side. So you'd have them going off and creating exact copies of one another, so you have two of the identical strands of DNA. Those then go into form nuclei around them, and you have this the replication of somatic cells. So that's how you replicate genetic code. We'll come to what the genetic code does in a moment here. These chromosomes in your body, the 46 chromosomes, are organized into pairs. These are called, there's 22 of them that are called autosomal pairs, and then you have one pair of sex chromosomes. This is the one that determines your sex. And a male has an X and a Y chromosome, and females have X and X chromosomes. Now, that means that because 50% of your DNA is coming from your mother and 50% from your father, the mother only has X chromosomes to contribute. So that's always going to contribute an X chromosome. But because a male has an X and a Y chromosome, it's 50-50 chance whether they will contribute the X or the Y. If they contribute the X, the offspring will be female. If they contribute the Y, the offspring will be male. And that's how sex is determined in biology. Now, when that happens, when these two sex cells come together, these gametes in sexual reproduction, you have one cell. You started out as a single cell. And that was 50% of your DNA from your mother, 50% of your DNA from your father, creates 46 chromosomes in you, and then that cell starts to separate into somatic cells, first 2, and then 4, and then 16, and then so on and so forth until you are at your trillion cells that you are today. And that mitosis process takes place where I explained already, where you've got in the nucleus of the cell, your DNA gathers enough nutrition so it can replicate itself. Those two nuclei separate, and you have 2 heart cells or 2 brain cells. And these are always happening first in your development as a child into an adult. We'll come back to that in a later chapter. But even as you're an adult, you're still constantly making new cells. I'm going to do it right now. I just killed a million skin cells by rubbing my hand. They're busy now replicating through mitosis. They are gathering up nutrition that my circulatory system is giving them, and they are building new cells because I've just destroyed some right there. The only exception to this mitosis are the special cells, the gametes, that are only used for reproduction. And your body, your DNA, tells your body to start producing these sex cells only after you reach a certain age, puberty. So you start to produce these cells once you've gotten to a certain age. And then you produce specialized cells that allow you to have offspring. And because, as I said before, natural selection is working upon variety. That's the important thing about the way evolution works, is that natural selection has to have something to select. It can't just be, if it's the same, if everybody's the same, then if the conditions change, everybody's wiped out all at once. That's how extinctions happen. But if somebody's different, and that difference is the key to survival, that is what natural selection is selecting. So it helps survival to have a bit of variety, right? And meiosis is a process that enhances that. Because, as I said, you take a single cell, and then you have the normal process of separating it into two. So you have, originally you start with a cell with 46 chromosomes, and then you double that, and then you split them, and you have then two with 46 chromosomes in them. But then meiosis does a second stage to that, which it then separates those 46 into 4 daughter cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, on the end of the process, each with 23. Now, at that second stage in particular, there is an opportunity to cross over, and you can translocate some of these elements of your DNA ladder, and your actually even whole chromosomes can switch around and swap. And this recombination and crossing over enhances variety. So even within a cell that has all the same DNA in it, you're actually jumbling it up in the process of meiosis, which then allows for one sex cell to not look exactly like the next sex cell. So even though you only have a limited amount of DNA, what is being chosen for reproduction is sort of a roll of the dice, right? And this is really important because if we go back to Mendelian genetics and the law of independent assortment, you can have extremely complex recombinations through actually what's a fairly simple process of taking one sex cell and another sex cell. Your book has a more complex, not much more complex, but another Punnett square in this chapter using the same pea plants that Mendel used in his first experiments. And we talked about one attribute, one characteristic last chapter, whether are you a short pea plant or are you a tall pea plant, right? And already from that you had, in the second generation, independently assorted characteristics that you could have a fully tall, a fully short, and then 2 hybrids in your Punnett square. But I want you to take a look at the graphic in your book about yellow pea seeds and green pea pods. Now these are 2 characteristics. It's the same thing as before, but they're 2 characteristics that are combined. And you're not just 2 characteristics in your body. You're millions of characteristics that are manifested in who you are. But let's just take 2, and you can, so a yellow pea pod and a green pea. And you put these in a Punnett square next to one another, both of the same type. So yellow pea pod, green pea, yellow pea, green pea pod, yellow pea, green pea pod, and you put them into a Punnett square, and you actually can have the exact opposite of their parents. You can have a yellow pea pod and a green pea as the result. There's a huge amount of variety just from combining these 2 characteristics and mathematically seeing the way it comes out, right? So this is something, the law of independent assortment can take seemingly simple processes and come up with a huge amount of variety, and that is exactly what natural selection is selecting from. So let's say the key to survival is to have a green pea and a yellow pea pod. Well, the parents who had those exact opposite characteristics can actually give offspring that could be just the key thing for surviving into the future. Now, you may say, okay, well, wait a minute, independent assortment, not everything is independent. And that's true. There are some things that we call linkages. And this is because on this DNA sequence, these ladders of codes of A, T, G, and C, you have some that are actually very close to one another. And as you are recombining through meiosis and you're swapping things over, they're so close that they often go together as packages. And so things like hair color and eye color. I was born with blonde hair and blue eyes, and that's pretty typical. People with brown hair often have brown eyes, and so these are things that there are linkages that often move around on the chromosomes as packages. This is so independent assortment. It has a limit based on some mechanistic features of the process of recombination. Now, what does DNA do? There's a chart in your book that I'd like you to look at. It's about the 20 amino acids, the DNA and protein synthesis, the 20 amino acids. And it's a really good illustrative example of what it is that DNA does. It's a simple thing, but there's also another one that's the 7 types of proteins and what they do as well. But very importantly, the chart on the 20 amino acids shows triplet codes of A, G, T, or C these triplet codes are the things that give instructions for the cells to produce certain materials. And this chart tells you what those materials do in your body. So, and there's some pretty amazing things like production of glucose and iron absorption in your body, and prevents fat deposits in the liver, and aids in blood clotting. What are some other ones? Involved in energy release from muscles during work. You kind of need to do that, right, to move around. So these amino acids are kind of like your building blocks for you. They're how you do what you do. They're your energy, they're your construction materials. And so how do you stand up? Well, you need these amino acids to get your muscles moving. You need strong bones to keep your structure upright, right? So your DNA, these little codes tell your cells to produce these materials and when to do that. Now, how does that happen? The way that I like to explain this is through the metaphor of constructing a building or something. And maybe some of you have been involved in construction before. I have myself. But you don't have to be that involved to understand the metaphor. That you have an architect who creates blueprints. Your blueprints are essentially your DNA. That is what you start with. Now, in later chapters, we're going to see that anybody who's been involved in construction knows that what you build is not exactly what the blueprints say. That some tile manufacturer went out of business and you had intended to use these particular tiles, but they don't exist. So you have to change plans, right? And there was some structural problem that you had to fix on the fly, and so there's a difference between the architectural blueprints that you start with and the plans for the building that you built that you submit to the city when you're done with the building. The city wants to know what you actually built, not what you intended to